Well, today's sermon is entitled Framing a Worldview, and I've noticed two things that just sitting up here today. One is that I think we men have been led into the secret in the world of women, and that Sheila said, pray for my husband to have some common sense. And I wonder if that's not a common prayer that women have. And I noticed another thing. Periodically, Helen will tell me, if there's a flat surface, you will put something on it. And I will deny that. However, I've noticed, since she wasn't sitting up here, here's this flat surface. And I've got all kinds of things on it. So as far as shaping a worldview, there it is. There it is. If you have ever found yourself in your life sabotaging yourself, has that ever occurred? I want to accomplish this, I want to do this, and with my own behavior, I sabotage it and I set it up. Well, after today, that will never happen again. Framing a worldview, and as odd as it may seem, I'm going to begin with a story about Rat Park. Yes, a park for rats. In the early 1960s, it was believed that addictions were like the demon addiction. You could take a drug and you would be captured for the rest of your life. And that drug had the power to do that. And I think many of you can remember, if you've seen propaganda films about marijuana from the 1930s and the 1940s, demon reefer will get you if you do it, or you take heroin one time and it's over. And that was a worldview. We had that worldview. As a matter of fact, our entire drug enforcement process was premised on that worldview. Stop people from getting drugs. So they get drugs that will take their lives away from them. Oh, and some of that is absolutely true. So this psychologist, Bruce Alexander, and if with any luck, he will be speaking to us next February in our community. If he has agreed to come, we just have to organize that. He and some colleagues in the early 1980s were doing experiments with rats. They call it Skinner's cage. And they're in these isolated cages. They could see each other, these rats. They could feed, but they couldn't touch each other. And they were doing these experiments where the rats, and you may have heard that, would go for the cocaine, the heroin, the addiction, rather than food and water. And if you remember that, and that reinforced that worldview, the demon drug. We could get so addicted to this demon drug that it would take our life from us, and we would even choose the drug over water and food. And if you ever struggled with drugs and alcohol or addiction to particular things, you know there's a powerful thing to that, and that truth could resonate, and in a way that matches that worldview. However, what Bruce Alexander did was, he said, wait a minute. Rats, he uses, I was watching this film the other day, he used the term, are colonial creatures. They are colony. They live in colonies. They have relationships with one another. They're curious. They have a limbic brain. It appears sometimes they think, and they're smart, and they play. So they created Rat Park, and he said they made this big thing, and they threw cans in there, and they threw sawdust in there, and they threw all kinds of stuff in there, and he said the rats just loved it. And they just, and they were playing. And he said that when you take a creature that lives in community and you put them in a steel cage in isolation, they are prone and vulnerable to addiction, to comfort that feeling of being estranged and isolated. And what he discovered was that these rats in Rat Park, when they were free to play and free to develop and free to give birth and to raise the young and just free, they had the triggers to the drugs and they had the drugs available, but these rats infrequently went to the drugs. When the community was healthy and the well-being was strong, infrequently went to the drugs. So he's questioning, why are addiction so prevalent and he was doing this in the 1980s. And he was excited over this discovery. And he was an addiction counselor, psychologist. He says, I found the answer. I know how to stop addictions. Just create communities where people can be free and be healthy and be with one another. And then when he put the literature out there, and he said the city liked it and the community liked it, but when it started to go toward, when this new piece of information tried to integrate a worldview, flat out rejected, because it countered the worldview and it countered the structure of treatment that was already in place. It died. Nobody paid attention to it. So there it is. We have new information trying to integrate into a worldview, but it can't integrate into a worldview. And although the experiment was replicated, so we would say there's some truth to it, it was not a consideration in the treatment process of addiction. Our society could not rearrange its communities to have the sense of well-being to stop the addictions, according to him, that are just growing and becoming epidemic. So we wonder, what's going on with ourselves, with our own worldviews? Do we have a worldview that couldn't handle information? So, given that, we know if we're going to shift worldviews, we're going to have resistance ourselves. That's a given. If we're going to change and we're going to have our own transformative process, we're going to resist. That's a truth. So how are we going to understand ourselves and having a worldview? As a matter of fact, there's a worldview out. I just read it this morning. It was that the present administration's drive toward education is designed to create more liberals. That's a worldview. Now, I can remember coming up in a Southern Baptist church and going to Southern Baptist Seminary that there were some people who warned me that going to seminary could ruin me. So that is a worldview, that education changes people. I have that same worldview. Education does change people. It broadens our perspective. But why are we so locked in sometimes to a worldview given the information that comes to us? That's what I want to look at today. There's a psychological research person named Sylvan Tompkins who was around in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And he took, I think it was like 400 images of baby faces. And he said, what is it that an infant feels? What is it that's physiological and that these facial expressions mean in these infants? And some people argue with his thinking and theory, and some people don't. They build a whole school of thought on it, and some people criticize it. So I'm not saying this as it's an absolute truth, but I'm saying this for consideration for who we are as people. And he said what he discovered in looking at these 400 facial expressions of infants is that in our affective self, and he says affect is our biology, and that emotion is our biography. So when he talks affect, he's talking something that's in the gray matter, that's in our biology. When he talks emotion, he's talking our biography. Something of how we put our narrative together and understand. And the affective dimensions of what it means to be human has a relationship with the emotional aspects of what it means to be human. And he says there are 6 affects that are at the core of who we are as human. Enjoyment, joy, interest, excitement, surprise, startle, anger, rage, disgust. Did you ever see an infant with the dismell? All you got? Dismell. Fear and terror and shame and humiliation. And that these 6 are foundational to who we are as human beings. And I thought, man, we don't stand a chance. That's 2 to 1 that we're not going to be happy creatures, because there's 3 There's 9 of them. There's 3 positive and 6 negative. We're already behind the 8 ball. But if you think about it, for surviving through time, those negatives are important because if I don't have a spare tire in my car, I want to see myself having a flat tire on I-95 that will motivate me to get a spare tire, to get my spare tire fixed. So that's a negative affect, a negative emotion doing that. And these affects will develop into a pattern. We will have a pattern of these affects in our life, and that pattern of how these 9 will be patterned and which will be dominant depends on our early life and in our environment, and the emotional atmosphere of the environment will stimulate. If you live in an angry, anxious environment, your anger, anxious affect will be more dominant than your joyful affect. If every time you're startled as a child, you receive a hug, or you receive a toy, or you receive something pleasant, or you're startled, and you see, Pickaboo's kind of a startled game. How many of you have not played Pickaboo with a child? I mean, I'll bet you if we put you on the airplane or in an airport and there's a little child in front of you and you're sitting there and you look up and the child pops its head up, you're going to look at that child and smile. And we're relational creatures. We bond that way. So for that person, being startled is a pleasant experience, is a positive experience, is a joyful experience. But now if you're startled and somebody pushes you or somebody says something critical, then with that startled, which is a deep affect, when that happens, that's not a pleasant experience. So under the same, as an adult, you have 2 different adults, you can have the exact same stimulus, but 2 different responses. Okay. So now we move into how these affects, once they begin to merge with emotions, the combinations of affects, and there's 100,000. I mean, it just starts crisscrossing, and it happens really fast. So fast, in fact, that if we remember that the limbic brain, the emotional brain, will fire before the cognitive brain. So when I have an experience on an unconscious level, I will have an affect that's firing, circling my imaginative process, finding memories that's congruent with that affective response, and I don't even know this is happening. And then my response will be congruent with that affect and the memories I've activated that go with that affect, and that will determine my external response. So there's an affective pattern and an emotional patterning that happens pretty quickly in our first 6, 8, 10 years of life. Helen and I have been working for over 20 years on a way of thinking about how we pattern our emotional lives and how our emotional lives get patterned. And we determined that with these 3 words, we can tell and get a view on how our emotional lives evolve. And these 3 words are joining, where in relationship we join one another where it's developmentally appropriate. If you've got a 2 and a 3-year-old child, it's developmentally appropriate to be quite protective. If the child is 8, 9, and 10, developmentally it's appropriate to let that child have a little more boundaries. So that changes through time. So when I'm joining that child, I take that child's world into account. Where are they developmentally? Make sense? Then there's also intrusive when you grow up. And intrusive would be shaming, critical. Speaking of being aware of the other person. Thank you, Helen. You water. Why my throat's so dry. Thanks. So any intrusiveness is anything that's intrusive, and you can think about that in your looking through your history, looking through your relationships today. Physical abuse, verbal abuse, shaming, critical, putting down, all those things that happen. That's intrusive. So here I am as a child, and if things are intrusive to me and people are verbally intrusive to me, my emotional life is going to shrink. I'm going to withdraw. I'll either withdraw passively or I will withdraw my emotionally safe self and I'll respond with anger. So I could, in anywhere on that continuum that can occur. Or absent. So it's joining, intrusive, or absent. If a parent is absent, or a particular way of relating is absent, the human being will long for that experience. We will long to contact the parent we never had. We will have a longing to contact something that we can love and something that we can bond with. I think the entire codependent field of literature is based on this. I will sacrifice myself, I will give of myself in hopes that I will get something back that will satisfy me, but it's in a pattern where that will not occur. So by the time I'm 10 or 15, I've got this affect pattern, and I've got these emotional patterns in place. You may remember, and I don't know if you are familiar with the work of Eric Burns, or the book Games People Play, or the triangle persecutor, rescuer, victim, that kind of triangle work that people play those games, where you'll have somebody who's aggressive to somebody else will come in and rescue, and then the whole household's upset. That would be considered a game, but more importantly, that perpetuates a particular emotional field through time that matches the pattern that was developed early in life. Even though it's an adult playing, we're still running the same pattern from early in life. Or there's another great one, well, no, it's not really great, but another one called the game of uproar. In the game of uproar, what happens in the game of uproar, I'm going to do something that I know that's going to make you angry. And if we've been in a relationship for 10 minutes, we know what will make the other person angry. Sure we do. So I'm going to do something that makes the other person angry. Then when the other person gets angry, that gives me permission to leave. And it's their fault for getting angry. It's called the game of uproar. Right? And people use it to go play golf, to go play softball, to go down the bar and shoot pool. People use that game. I mean, it's a useful tool. Isn't it? It's useful. It works. I mean, it works. I mean, it happens in church. It really happens when a person has a fear of intimacy and a fear of closeness. And especially you can see it in church and groups when somebody starts to get close in community, and the next thing you know, there's an argument. Oh, that's not a safe place to be, and then they're gone forever. I mean, we see it in small in relationships and couples, but we do see it. We do see it in community. I mean, my God, just look at our Congress and Senate and executive branch. I mean, don't we see it? They're arguing. Next thing you know, one's in a huff and they're gone. And nothing's done. Except for the solidification of the pattern that creates that emotional life. That stays. That remains consistent through time. The other one is commonly used. They call it parent, adult, child. And often in relationships or communities, you have somebody who becomes the critical parent and somebody else who becomes the bad child. You didn't show up on time. You're late. You didn't clean up. You put something flat here and it was on the flat. So, whatever it is. Whatever it is, see? And I may be playing that game to become the criticized child so I can sulk away and leave. I may manipulate the person to criticize me to justify my victimization and my self-righteousness. Okay? But the point is, we will have patterns in life and relational styles that will continue that affect and emotional patterns through life. We just do it as human beings. It's how we as human beings function. Here's the problem with that. I mean, and some of it's good. I mean, we need to do it. We come together in community and we got these emotional maps, and we even changed in this church, as grandiose as we might be, more as I might be. We have 7 principles. We just threw in an 8th principle, and that 8th principle was the first principle: we will work to create an emotionally safe environment. Without an emotionally safe environment, there will be no spiritual transformation. There will be no change. If our environment is not emotionally safe, it will only reinforce why I need to defend my inner self the way I defend my inner self, because the environment's not emotionally safe. Now, as I just said earlier, I may set up the community so that it's not emotionally safe for me, so I don't have to deal with my issues. I can do that. But if we work toward an emotionally safe place, and we continue to promote kindness as our central value, then I can begin to ask myself, is what I'm doing contributing to an emotionally safe place? Is my behavior kind? And that doesn't mean we don't confront. That doesn't mean we don't sometimes get in each other's faces. But what it does mean, when we do confront and when we do get in each other's faces, that it's not the end of our relationship. See, that's how you can tell. If we have an argument and we're here next Sunday and the Sunday after that working on projects and we have arguments and we're ongoing, then the community is emotionally safe. Okay? If we have an argument and I leave forever, then some kind of game or some kind of an emotional field has been perpetuated and I'm really not involved in the transformation process. I'm not talking about a community that's perpetually egregious or perpetually abusive. You ought to leave that. And we think about this on a theological plane, on an understanding of God or the powers that be. How many people have a God that's judgmental and throws lightning bolts? If I'm going to have a God, I got news for you. It's going to be a nice God. She's going to be kind. I mean, why not? Because my abstract worldview and my abstract process is related to my deep affect and my emotional pattern. There's a relationship. And when somebody votes for harsh people, has a harsh theology, they're harsh to themselves inside. It's a match. There's security in it, and I understand all that. There's the sameness in it, and I understand all that. But there's no transformation in it. It is the same through time. Now here comes a problem. Okay? So I'm growing up in life, and I go into this church, and I hear these words in this church that we ought to love one another, that we ought to care for one another, that we ought to promote a democratic society, that we ought to promote a society that meets the needs of everybody the best that we can. And so I hear a community speak those words, and I think, yes, I want to join that community. Okay? However, I got this emotional pattern inside me. My affect has been developed in a particular way, given the emotional environment of my early life. That patterning may not be congruent with the vision I want. So I join this community, and I want this sense of deep love, and I want a sense of belonging, and I want a sense of caring. Of course, as human beings, as we looked at Rat Park, remember that? Not that there were rats, but hey, there are some similarities. When we looked at Rat Park, when things were going well, and the rats were free, they didn't go to the cocaine, they didn't go to the heroin, they didn't go to the drugs, they didn't go to the alcohol, because there was a well-being and there was a healthy, functioning community. And to that I say yes. How many of you know the books, The Addictive Society? Addicted to the Feeling of Acquisition. I mean, the social commentators of our society, this is what they're writing. Now, Bruce Alexander just finished a book called The Globalization of Addiction and Its Relationship to Our Economic Structure. Yeah. I'm in that economic structure. I'm in that addictive process as they describe it. I'm in it. That means if I'm in it, my emotional life and my affective patterning, the biology, and that deep emotion is structured to match the addictive society. How can it be otherwise if I'm in it? And we're in it. Look at it. So here I am. I'm agreeing to this vision. I'm going yes to this vision. But I bring patterns that sabotage myself from joining in a community and participating in bringing about that vision. What happens to me when I say yes to that community? 4 months later, I do something, and I say, no, there's something wrong with that community. So I leave it. Churches are great places because there's always another one. Okay? So I go to another community. 4 or 5 months later, I do the same thing. It's not my fault. I'm doing the right thing. It's the community's fault. It's the church's fault. It's the club's fault. It's this fault. Every time I go home to visit my parents, I end up drunk. It's my parents' fault. Whatever it is. Whatever it is, it's somebody else's fault. But I'm old enough now to look back on my life and begin to do some self-reflection and see those patterns. If I see that vision, that's really a vision of light and kindness and learning to care for self and for others and the planet, and I see that, I know I come from a culture that structures me to perpetuate the culture. That's what family systems do. That's what media does. That's what schools do. That's what our religious institutions do. That's what our business institutions do. It conforms us into a way to perpetuate itself. That's what it does. But I see this other way that just feels more human, that just feels more participatory with the planet itself. I've got to be gracious to myself. I've got to say, you know, you've been geared this way, and I literally mean in a way, I've been geared this way. I've been honed. I've been taught as a child what to do, what not to do, to cry or not to cry, or to go in this direction or to go in that direction in life as a career. But I see this other way. My first step is to say, I want to graft into that vine. I want to graft into that narrative. I want to become part of that narrative. But I know in myself, I have the potential to sabotage what I want. I've got to start there. I can tell you mine. Scapegoat, rescuer, whatever. Outsider looking in. I got some of that in me. Not joining, just watching from the outside. In case it gets to whatever it gets, then I can go back in the woods and play. You know, I've got some of that. Hero child, the one who's dominant. The one who has to always be right, even if right means the relationship. This culture is powerful about being right is more important than a relationship. That's in us. We have an economic process that says, here are the laws and this is what we do. And it seems to be, has no regard for the local community or for the way a community's existed for 500 years. We're just going to do this because we have the power and we structured the law that gives us permission to do it. I'm scripted that way as an American. So I see this vision. It feels good. It feels right. I'm going to acknowledge that I'm going to have trouble doing that. So I'm going to learn to take care of myself along the way. And even if I have an argument, and even if I don't see things eye to people, I know the direction of the community is moving in a positive, good way. I'm going to commit to that larger direction. And I'm not going to let a pattern from my history sabotage my larger vision. And I'm going to join a community that has that larger vision. And I'm going to dedicate myself to it, knowing there are times I'm going to be resistant. I know that. Everybody in this room has a family of origin map that's got traces of joining and developmentally appropriate responses. That's got traces of people being absent when they should have been present. And then that's got places where people were intrusive when they ought not to have been intrusive. We all have that. If there's 50 people in this room, we got 50 of those emotional maps trying to find a place to be. It gets complicated. But we can do that if we just recognize that is what's going on. And deal with it. Talk to each other about it. We see the vision. We can accomplish the vision if I can get myself out of the way. Maybe that's the biggest calling we have as human beings. Can we get ourselves out of the way of life unfolding? Maybe that's our biggest calling. Thank you. Well, thank you. At